Good evening. I'm Sanford Unger, Dean of the School of Communication here at American University. I want to welcome all of you to this second for this semester in our series of American Forums. We're joined tonight by a national audience on the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network, C-SPAN, on National Public Radio, and an international audience on the Voice of America. I want to thank the Fund for Investigative Journalism, which is co-sponsor of this event. We appreciate their interest and support. They have sponsored investigative journalism and attempts to get beneath the surface in reporting for many years in Washington. Before I begin, I just want to remind you about our next forum. I feel like I'm forever doing that, but on October 14th, 2 weeks from tomorrow night, we'll have another forum on whatever happened to the energy crisis in the media. That will take place in the School of International Service Lounge on this campus. And tonight, after this forum, I invite you to join us and the guests downstairs for a brief reception, downstairs in this building. The purpose of the American Forum generally is to talk about controversial issues in journalism and communication, to attempt to bring together differing points of view on current issues. And tonight we want specifically to do that about the issue of the vigor of reporting in Washington. We have some people on the panel who probably think that the typical Washington reporting is not vigorous enough, and some who might think it's too vigorous. Let me introduce them to you. Beginning at this end of the table is Rich Jaroslavsky from the Wall Street Journal, political features editor in the Washington Bureau. He's only worked for two newspapers in his career. One was the Stanford Daily, and the other is the Wall Street Journal, where he went to work in 1975, worked in Cleveland, then in Washington. He achieved some notoriety in the 1984 presidential campaign for reporting on President Reagan's age as a political issue, a story that most people were not at that time taking up. Next is James Polk, who is investigative reporter in the NBC News Bureau in Washington, covering political corruption and crime. Jim Polk has covered many controversial stories, including Abscan, the Raymond Donovan investigations, Geraldine Ferraro and John Zaccaro finances, the Burt Lance case, the Billy Carter payments, Tylenol murders in Chicago, and so on. He received a Pulitzer Prize in 1974 for his Watergate coverage at the Washington Star, has received many other awards over the years, and is past president and national chairman of the journalism organization Investigative Reporters and Editors. Next to Jim Polk is Julian Bond. Julian Bond was a very prominent civil rights leader in the South for many years, one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, back in 1960. He was first elected in 1965 to a one-year term in the Georgia House of Representatives, but was not permitted to take his seat because of his outspoken opposition to the war in Vietnam. That happened on at least one other occasion when he was, and after a Supreme Court decision, he was finally seated in December 1966, I believe. Elected to the state Senate in Georgia in 1974, where he served until he left office in January of this year, having run for Congress and been defeated for the Democratic nomination. Julian Bond is the host of America's Black Forum, which is the only black-owned program in television syndication. Speaking recently to the National Association of Black Journalists, July of this year, Julian Bond said, "Everyone is fair game to the press in a foul game with no standards and no rules." He said that newspapers, television, and radio treat public figures and private citizens any way they can and any way they want to, with gross invasions of privacy and pop psychoanalytic portraits of prominent figures in the news. To my immediate left is the Honorable Helen Bentley, member of Congress from Maryland, from Baltimore. Ms. Bentley served for 24 years, if I'm not mistaken, as a maritime reporter for the Baltimore Sun. She is herself had a long career in the media. Later, 1969 to 75, was chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission and found herself on the other side of many issues with the media. She was elected to the 99th Congress in 1984, is now serving her second term from Baltimore. Representative Bentley gave a speech in 1970, 17 years ago, while she was serving in the Nixon administration, which attracted a great deal of attention, in which she asked this question: are we indeed truly journalists in the great tradition of the past, objective in our outlook, judicious in our coverage of news, balanced in that coverage, fair in our reporting in depth, or have we become infected by the times? In plain words, are we today, by and large, responsible journalists intent that our work shall result in the public good, or are many of us merely word merchants after the fast buck? To the left of Congresswoman Bentley is Seymour Hersh, who is probably the best-known investigative reporter in this country, has been called an unrivaled master of the governmental expose. Perhaps the most famous thing that Cy Hersh has done was to write about the massacre at My Lai during the Vietnam War, which resulted in, among other things, trial of some of the soldiers who were involved. Some people have accused Cy Hersh of using dirty tricks to get information. We may have an opportunity to discuss that. He's worked for the Chicago City News Bureau, United Press International, Associated Press, did pioneering work on chemical and biological warfare, has been honored with the Pulitzer Prize and other awards for his work, wrote a book about Henry Kissinger that has attracted a great deal of attention and controversy. A.M. Rosenthal, then the executive editor of the New York Times, once referred to Cy Hersh as the most valuable journalism property in the country. He did work for the New York Times for a while, no longer does. Wrote a book about the Korean Airlines flight, 007, that was shot down by the Soviet Union. Well, that's the cast of characters for this evening, and I want to begin. I want us to get to the various questions that pose themselves in this topic, but I want to begin with the issue of whether or not the standard coverage of Washington, the coverage that most of us read every day or most of us see on television, really neglects the most important stories, the essence of what's really happening in Washington. And Representative Bentley, I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, I feel that one of the most important stories that's going on in Washington today and is not related adequately by the press is the economic problems, the debt of this country, and the far-ranging effects that's going to have. I'm concerned on it from both the trade point of view and from the operating deficit point of view, and what it's going to mean to these young people, these people right here in front of us in this audience, in the years to come when they have this debt to repay, the debt that we're building up. And I don't think the people in this country really realize what is happening to them, what is happening to the country with the credit then on which we're operating, and the media has not explained it sufficiently and made it sexy. I mean, that's one of the things, one of the reasons it's not. It's not a sexy subject.
Is there a motive that you would infer, a reason why this story is not covered
No,
adequately?
I don't think it's a motive particularly, although at times I think on the trade deficit that the media is sold on the basis of we need to import rather than to produce, and we need to become a country of service rather than a country of manufacturing and production. And I think that there is a very narrow point of view on this among the media.
Jim Polk, you might have a different idea of what the major stories are that are not covered in Washington.
Most of Washington is not covered.
Most of daily life is not covered. By definition, news is the exception, not the humdrum. We cover only a fragment of what goes on in our federal government. It's too large. We can't grasp it. We seize and report upon the exceptions. News zeroes in on conflict and danger, suspense and doom. Complicated stories are difficult to do, and many reporters shy away from them. What Congresswoman Bentley mentioned is what I call a what-if story. What if this happens? What if that happens? Those are not stories that lend themselves to easy answers. They're an examination of a variety of assumptions on what might happen, and not necessarily simple facts. The complicated stories go uncovered by and large because they just do not reduce themselves to the simplicities with which we cover news.
But don't you think, and I want other people to join in this, don't you think we spend an awful lot of energy, resources, time, person power of the media covering routine movements, say, of the President of the United States, the enormous number of people who cover the White House and really find nothing out, the enormous amount of coverage that gets passed along to the public, which neglects what may really be happening, not just at the White House, but in Washington generally. So how do you feel about that?
Well, you know, this is...
Would you take a job covering the White House for somebody?
No. It's too much like being a stenographer. Well, you know, you do have a problem. I mean, you know, this is probably, I guess I would describe this guy, if I were poor, rural, black, Hispanic. I don't know why I wouldn't think he was the biggest son of a bitch going, the President of the United States. But most of the press isn't, so we tend to take what they say and go with it.
You know, the press is kind of lazy these days, too, if I may say so. I can't tell you how many times when we have a news story that, a release, or I call a reporter to tip them off about something, and they want us to provide all of the information in my office. I never thought of doing that when I was a reporter. I got out there and dug.
Having spent 4 very long years as a White House correspondent, I can first of all associate myself entirely with Mr. Hersh's remarks. The thing that struck me during that period of time when we were being spoon-fed every day, twice a day, sometimes 3 times, was that it seemed as though we spent an awful lot of time trying to report about things that no one knew, instead of spending more time trying to report about things that everyone knew but never really looked at. And I think that possibly the deficit question is one of those issues, but there are a lot of others. And when you get caught up in the routine of always having to be at a briefing at a certain time, the sheer physical exertion of having to be on a trip listening to the President make 5 speeches in a day, you really do tend to lose sight, I think, of what is important to people outside of Washington.
Julian Bond, do you think there's a failure to dig and a failure to...
I'm sure there is. I'm sure there are just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of events and occurrences that happen in the offices here, in the bureaucracy, in all of the departments of the federal government that no one writes about. Occasionally some bureaucrat leaks some particularly scandalous information and it becomes news for a couple of days. Someone has done wrong, or someone has committed some kind of evil or broken the law. But it's partly the nature, I think, of the beast, this pack journalism. A pack surrounds the president almost out of necessity. ABC doesn't want CBS to get something, and NBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on. And so they focus on the man in this case, and all these other things just go away. Then again, as you say, they're not sexy. They don't grab the public's attention. They don't scream from the headlines. They don't reduce themselves to 30 seconds or a minute on TV. They're difficult to explain to people, and because they're difficult, they therefore just aren't explained.
Is there, you know, one of the stories that I think leaps out historically was the case of Wilbur Mills, Congressman Wilbur Mills, in the 1970s, when it was reported that, I think as I recall the incident, someone jumped into the tidal basin. I believe it was his friend, Fanny Fox, that's right, who jumped into the tidal basin. And the story at the time was that Wilbur Mills, then chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, had been protected by the press for years. That people had known about Wilbur Mills' behavior, but no one dared write about it. Not so much for fear of libeling him, but because there was a kind of informal, unwritten pact between prominent figures like Wilbur Mills and the media that certain things would not be revealed.
Well, I don't think anybody knew about Fanny Fox for years. There were reports of Wilbur Mills' drinking problem. Let's be very specific. Mm-hmm. And we didn't write about the reports of his drinking problem. Now, what's the question?
Should that have been written about? Should that have been revealed sooner? When this was the man who was in charge of writing tax legislation, who had so much power and influence in Washington?
The prevailing philosophy at that time was simply that if your private life did not affect your public life, or become part of a police report, as the Fannie Fox incident did, then it went unmentioned. The standards obviously have changed in light of the Miami Herald Gary Hart story, but that was also an issue of a presidential candidate's judgment and truthfulness. Right now the standards are in flux, and I don't know what they're going to be a year from now.
But at the same time, in the period, it's unfair to say that this just happened with Gary Hart, that now we, for the first time, are just looking into the private lives of public figures. Compare two figures in the past, both of them dead, Martin Luther King and Adam Clayton Powell. 20 years ago, the FBI is just feeding American newspapers information about Dr. King's alleged sex life, and almost every American newspaper refused to print it. At the same time, the New York Times was just regaling its readers, uncharacteristically for this newspaper, with details about Representative Powell's trips to Europe with two female members of his staff, one black, one white. His response, of course...
Paid with tax money.
Well,
yeah.
they work for him. They work for him. And as he said, you wouldn't want me to take an all-black delegation, would you? And, you know, there was then a double standard. If the person was popular and well-liked or respected, then their private lives were hushed. If the person was arrogant, and arrogant means, you know, as a synonym for taste in mistresses, if the person was arrogant and didn't have friends in the press, as Gary Hart didn't, as I'm beginning to think Senator Biden may not have done, then their public life was fair game. Their private life, rather, was fair game.
Julian, in today's market, and that's why I think we describe it, I don't think that the press today would hold back on anybody as they did in when we were talking about Wilbur Mills. And in those days, there were a number of them. I was on the Hill at that time, both as a press person prior to that, and then as chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission. And at that time, there were a number of the congressional people who were protected in the same fashion. I mean, their private lives were just not involved. They're drinking. It was drinking primarily then. I don't think today that they picked on Joe Biden or Gary Hart because there weren't any friends in the press. I think in both instances, frankly, if either one of those two men had been in the press prior to their current life, they would not have done what they did in running for the presidency. I mean, you learn.
You know, in the aftermath of what happened to Hart, the journalist said, well, we did it because he challenged us to do it. I'd like to think that they did it because it was newsworthy and worthwhile. And you'd hate to think, you know, what if he had challenged them to examine their own sex lives? Would they have picked up this challenge as quickly and abruptly? Probably not, because they're not running for president. He was. But I think the standard has changed a great deal.
Yes.
Well, the Miami Herald story is still an aberration. I've spent some time in the last couple of weeks on panels like this with the two key Miami Herald reporters involved. To them, it was an issue of truthfulness on the part of the candidate. Strangely, the Miami Herald, I guess, alone among most major newspapers, insists it was unfamiliar with the previous reports of a double life on the part of Senator Hart that had followed him for 15 years. I think the Miami Herald did the story, in my personal opinion, simply because it was a local news story. The allegation involved a Miami model, and it was another newspaper chasing a story in its own backyard. But even after they did the story, still many reporters would not go and check that out. I've told the Herald reporters I wouldn't do the same story.
Did you think it was a good story? I mean, just technically, what they wrote.
Technically, it was not a good story.
Terrible.
But the Hart's downfall was a simple fact: he could not answer the questions that were posed by the story.
They claimed to have
watched,
they claimed to have had a total surveillance on his house, and it turned out that actually for half the night they weren't there. And so they were really missing. They were really winging it.
Yeah, I was in the house on Saturday, and I left by the back door. You know, it's easy to do. You just come out of the deck.
Not that Saturday.
You mean you were
This past Saturday. This past Saturday.
I was just going to say.
And
that's a part of the story.
That was a hell of a party.
but it's, you know, it's easy.
Why didn't you invite me, Julian?
There were too many people there already. Anyway, it's easy to come and go out of the back door of the house, and it's plain to see that, you know, they just really could not have known how many people who went in the front door remained and came out the front door again in the morning. Just no way for them to have known.
So the funny thing about that story is that just in technical terms, forgetting the morality of whether they should or shouldn't, they really didn't have a story they should have published.
It's another case of convicting the right guy for the wrong reasons?
Or something. I don't know what it was. There's some lesson in that. I don't know what it is.
Julian, you suggested a moment ago that there's a double standard. It had to do with whether a person was popular or not, or well-liked. I mean, do you want to take that further? I wonder, you yourself have had some trouble with the newspapers in Atlanta, I believe, in the recent period. And you were something of a hero in the South during the late 1960s and the early 1970s. You've been a very prominent figure who I think enjoyed, I think it's fair to say, a very good press for a long time. What happened? What changed for you?
Well, I never enjoyed a good press with these newspapers. I was responsible, at least partially, for their divestiture, you know, the breakup of the Cox monopoly in Atlanta. At one time in Atlanta, the same family owned the morning newspaper, the afternoon newspaper, the biggest AM station, the biggest FM station, the cable system, and the biggest TV station. One family owned all of this, and I helped participate in the breakup of this monopoly. And I've had a constant running battle over the years with the editors over one thing or another, typically their coverage of racial questions. So while I've always had a very, very good relationship with journalists generally, I never had a good relationship with these people. And I couldn't help but think when I became involved in scandal, and my name is linked with allegations of cocaine use and, you know, a wide variety of other people also involved in this, I couldn't help but think that despite the newsworthiness of this, that at least a portion of it stemmed from the historical enmity which some of the people there felt against me, and now had the chance to get back at this guy who had been at least a small thorn in their sides for many, many years.
Could this have been handled in any way that you would have thought was acceptable?
It's difficult to say. You have to go into some detail about what happened. There were charges made against me and then withdrawn. And then the story proceeded on. The paper assigned a 15-person team to investigate, including a 3-person team whose sole responsibility was to look into my private life. Called a woman I know here in Washington and said, "Doesn't Julian Bond habitually sleep with you when he comes to Washington?" And on and on and on in this vein. Probably there was no way it could have been reported that would have made me happy, but there probably could have been a way that it could have been reported which would have made me less sad.
Hersh, what about this, the extent to which certain people do get treated in a particular way in the press? I think this is relevant to Julian Bond's case. It's also relevant in a way to Henry Kissinger's adulation in the press. You have not joined in that adulation. You broke some stories about Henry Kissinger that made you unpopular in some circles. But is there some, I mean, obviously it's unwritten, but is there some way to describe the set of rules that launch somebody into the favored category or the unfavored category?
Very simple. Those who leak to us, we like. When I first joined the New York Times in May of '72, I sat in what was then known as the foreign cluster. And I was, as you said, somebody who was pretty clear where I stood in the Vietnam War. You know, I basically thought I had First Amendment rights as a journalist, and I hated it. I hated the war, that the notion that my country was raping, murdering, defoliating, and basically destroying a country daily in my name drove me nuts. And therefore, I was stunned to find that there would be a reverential hush in the cluster at 5 o'clock, because Henry Kissinger would call the bureau chief then, and then give him that day's newspaper, that day's story, and then after 10 minutes or so, the secretary of the bureau chief would come to the chief foreign affairs writer and say, "We're transferring Henry to you now," and then my colleague would sit over there and go, uh-huh, nod, take notes, laugh at the appropriate time, hang up, and then put a piece of paper in the typewriter. This is back in the days when they had typewriters. And write a story that would say something flashy and describe it, comma, senior official said today. And I don't know if I ever said it. I like to think I said it. I know I thought it, and I probably did say it after 2 or 3 days of this, being basically new to the New York Times. I said to this fellow, who was a perfectly good reporter, I said, do you ever ask anybody else about what he says? And it was, oh no, I mean, he wouldn't talk to us if we did. The man had it made. It was beautiful.
Why do you say he was a basically good reporter? It would seem to me that it's a fair dividing line between a good reporter and a not so good reporter if you are willing to, and on occasion, have bid a source. I mean, I got frozen out for 3 months by my best source at the White House, who was a high official, because I wrote something that he didn't like.
I think the notion of freezing out Henry Kissinger in 1972 at the New York Times was as foreign as any notion could be. It just wouldn't happen.
Is that not a somewhat sad commentary on the New York Times?
No, I just think it's a reality. If you'd been doing it to any paper, it would have been that notion.
Rich,
I want to jump in. This is a human factor. Those who leak to us, we like, as I said. We get suckered by people who are willing to give us a little bit. We feel flattered to be close to the power. The classic recent case has been Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Newsweek published a little item that said, well, North really was our source for this, regardless of what he said in testimony. But I've heard Newsweek's correspondent say on a panel such as this that before November of last year, when the Iran arms scandal broke into the open, for 2 or 3 months, Newsweek had a complete set of notes from an unnamed source on the Iran arms deal and how we got hostages out. Newsweek did not name the source in that panel, and apparently their complete set of notes did not extend to the diversion of money to Nicaragua. They were given the information on the condition that they not publish until the entire operation was over. I suspect that came from Oliver North. One of our NBC correspondents whispered to me in the corridor at the time it did break. Ollie North has been my best source. He was everyone's source in this town. And we do get suckered. Sorry, we try to avoid it. We're doing a lot of lashing ourselves on the back with whips today and telling you about some of our problems and some of the ways which we think we do not do our job well enough. But occasionally, we get suckered. We try to avoid it, and sometimes we just don't.
You could almost say occasionally we sometimes don't get suckered.
Well, Rich, I want to ask you how common you think that practice is. I mean, is that still today, with all these new rules we're talking about, with all the changes in the attitude of the media, is it a pretty common thing for a government official like Henry Kissinger today to be able to call up and basically, as if calling Pravda, get the official version reported?
I think that it is probably somewhat less common now than it might have been 15 years ago because of all the water that has gone over the dam since then. I mean, people in our business may be slow to learn some lessons, but we did learn some lessons, I think, from Watergate. I think Cy Hersh taught us some lessons, perhaps, about Henry Kissinger, and I would like to think that it's still that it's somewhat less common. By the same token, we all have daily jobs to do, and it's a very, very grave hardship, I can tell you from personal experience, when you get frozen out. And so there is going to be a natural, one would hope at least it's unconscious, desire on the part of a lot of people not to offend good sources. That's just human nature, and we are all humans.
Cy, do you think things have changed much in the 15 years since you saw that happening at the Times?
Oh yeah, I do think there's more sensitivity to that kind of abuse. It doesn't mean you can prevent it. I think there's something that should be said here, which is that there's an inherent limit. We talk as if we have such unbridled power. I honestly believe that it seems clear from what we've seen just happen with Iran-Contra, with the whole Reagan administration, with the whole issue with the war against Nicaragua, with Watergate. It seems clear that if the President of the United States chooses not to tell us the truth and surrounds himself with a national security advisor and others who are perfectly prepared to also not tell us the truth, we don't get the truth. So we are really proscribed in our power very much. As Rick said, we're dependent on sources. And there's sort of an unfair balance, I guess. I guess Helen's here to represent not only the federal government but Congress, and Julian perhaps to represent the Congress too, but the legislative. But the fact is that we in the press simply don't have the power that, you know, I'd like to think we could have and should have. These guys, if they choose to lie to us, there's absolutely no way Ronald Reagan tomorrow, if he chooses to lie to us and Carlucci goes along with it, can't beat us. Beat us dead.
Well, it may be getting hard to remember the days at the Sun and whether these, how you felt about it then, but how do you react to that, Ms. Bentley?
I don't think that in this day and age that anybody could keep it from the press for a very long period of time. I really don't.
But Helen, Iran-Contra was broken by a Lebanese newspaper, you know, after about a year and a half.
But it broke.
As a leak from Gorbachev had been cut out of the deal.
Right.
But
Probably.
it broke. But it broke.
But it didn't break because of anything that any of us did in the
Okay.
United
All right,
States.
that's what you're saying.
Well, what I'm saying is that there is an imbalance. I think these guys have, you know, they can keep secrets a hell of a lot better than we like to think they can.
When I wanted to impress people covering the White House, I used to tell them that by God, I could always get Ed Meese to return my calls. Couldn't get him to tell me anything worth a damn, but he could always return my calls.
You've been on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I sure
and,
have.
and I wonder...
I think I was a pretty good investigative reporter when I was
I'll attest to
on the
that.
Sun.
She was tough. Tougher nails.
That's the Sun paper. I was in Vietnam, too, for about 4.5 months covering the economic end of it. And I like to hear Bob Comer. Bob Comer said that on more than one occasion that the president would wake up in the morning, President Johnson would wake up in the morning and feel good until he read the Baltimore Sun, and then he'd want to throw up.
and that made you feel good.
At that time it did, because I felt I was getting through. I was getting through on what the jam up of all of the materials going into Vietnam, what problems they were causing, and that there was no no strategic plan out there for handling anything. And the ships, we had 121 ships tied up out there at one time, and that was my end of it, my specialty. And I went out to find out what was happening and why, and we finally got the log jam broken. But we worked at that time, we worked very, very hard. I know that some of the reporters today do it. There's one thing that all of us do. Even I did it the other day, and I know some of the press does it today. They have a tendency to pick up errors from other publications. And a publication may make an error, and instead of checking it out, they pick it up, and it's multiplied that way. I happened to do this the other day in a statement on the floor. I was reading a Washington Post article which talked about the number of former Reagan administration officials who are now being on the Toshiba payroll to try and keep Congress from banning their products in this country. And in the article, it quoted a man, Clyde Prestowitz, throughout the article, never saying that Clyde was not one of those who was on the payroll, just quoted him. And in reading it in a hurry, I assumed that he had gone that way, and I was very disappointed and upset. I got on the floor today and apologized for ever having said this. But we all have a tendency at times to do this, and I want to tell anybody who's a journalist or a would-be journalist or that, for heaven's sakes, check out your own facts.
You know, there's a double question I'm tempted to ask you, which can be put pretty straightforwardly. Do you think you were often lied to as a reporter?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I don't.
And have you often or ever lied to a reporter as a government official or a member of Congress?
No, I have not, because I know better.
Have you ever told a reporter less than the full story?
I have talked to a reporter off the record. In fact, I did just the other day, give her a whole story on a federal judgeship that's pending, and I said, you know, this is the whole background, the accurate background. You can't attribute it to me, but that's what's happening. And I do talk with them, and I'm very frank with them. Those that I trust, I'll talk off the record. Those that I don't talk off the record. I just answer their questions, a simple yes or no, and let it go at that.
But to have...
That's not an exception, by the way. Most public officials will handle it the same way. If they have built up, if they know the reporter is not going to cost them their job by doing something reckless, and that's what one means by trust. They will, and will treat the situation fairly, then they will talk.
You know who's one of the best at that? Gary Hart, by the way. When Gary Hart was on the Intelligence Committee on defense issues, he was a pleasure to deal with as a journalist because he was always on the record, and he was always telling you what he wasn't telling you. He always made it clear, I can't say this or that. I enjoyed working with him as a journalist. Sort of funny.
Generally, they will not lie, but public officials will pick and choose what they say, and perhaps leave a reporter who is careless with the wrong impression. Or there is one effective lie that's very difficult to penetrate, and that's the simple word no. But other than that, people generally don't lie. Occasionally get a denial.
Except at the very top of the White House.
Yeah.
But to have had a career in which no one has lied to you and you've never lied is a pretty pure existence in a messy business.
Well, I won't say that it's... first of all, as far as I as a reporter knew that you can't get away with telling... as a reporter, I knew that you couldn't get away with misleading a reporter. I may not tell them everything, as I said, somebody I didn't trust. But let me put it this way. I said I'd never been lied to. I had denials on stories. One, as a matter of fact, dealt with the Bay of Pigs. And at the time when we were going to do the exchange of drugs, prescription drugs, to get our prisoners back, there was a ship that was in the Baltimore shipyard being renovated and being ready to go down take the drugs down and to bring the refugees back, and hundreds of Cubans who were coming over to this country. And when I called up at that time the Kennedy administration to ask them about this, they denied that it was happening. They denied that there were any negotiations going on at all concerning the Bay of Pigs. And I went ahead and did the story anyhow, and I was right. They did load the ship up, they did take it to Cuba, they did discharge it, and they did load it up with people and bring it back into Port Everglades. So I was wrong. I had been lied to.
Often, to be effective as a reporter, you have to do exactly what Congresswoman Bentley has described you. You have to know the right question before you get the answer. Two secrets of being a good reporter is being able to identify the question and persistence. Keep on asking the question. Pit bull approach.
But you know, Washington also has very, very flexible standards about what constitutes a lie. I lost count of how many times I was lied to at about my third White House briefing. And when you ask the president's spokesman time after time, as we, in acting as pit bulls, led by Sam Donaldson, I guess, used to do, Larry, is the president considering pulling the Marines out of Lebanon? I mean, we must have asked that question hundreds of times. We all in the room knew quite well that, yes, the president had to be thinking about that. But Larry Speaks, whose job it was to stand up in front of us, would say no. Now, in my book, that's a lie. Maybe it's not as bad a lie because we all knew he was lying.
But what's the point of asking the question if you all knew that he was thinking of... What's the point of pushing ahead on the official answer rather than reporting what everyone knew?
The answer, that gets back to what I said earlier about we sometimes don't do as good a job reporting what everyone knows. But the answer is you have to do both. The answer is that you have to ask the question because this is the President of the United States and because we feel that he has an obligation to tell America the truth. But you also have to go further. You have to say the White House said no, but here's the evidence all around you that says yes.
But as Hersh pointed out before, the White House was insisting it wasn't selling arms to Iran, and it was selling arms to Iran. And no one of all these people, high-paid, well-trained people covering the White House and the State Department, ever managed to break that story.
That's exactly why God created investigative reporters, because we sitting at the White House could never have broken that
I
story.
thought you were going to say that's why God created Lebanese newspapers.
Not sure.
People tried to break that story before it happened. It was a well-kept secret. We heard 2 months before it broke that $1 million in arms had been shipped to Iran to ransom the first hostage. We heard it from another reporter whose
Jack Anderson actually wrote 4 columns on it.
Whose news outfit had been dealing with North. And we asked a lot of people, and some lied, and a lot of the others didn't know.
But it is amazing, with all these junkyard dogs sitting around, you know, wanting to investigate, wanting to be mean and write these stories, it is amazing that so many secrets can be kept, as Hersh said before. And that would
They all
indicate...
can. The point I make is not so many. I think they all can. I think if the president wants to lie to us and his national security advisor wants to lie to us and senior people in the Pentagon agree to lie to us, we lose.
National security people are professionals at keeping secrets. And often we're outmatched.
Yeah, but it's more than keeping secrets. It's they're professionals, I guess you want to say, at lying to keep secrets, I guess. And that's too bad. I mean, that's an accepted morality. Dan Ellsberg tells a story about being at a meeting once when he was working for John McNaughton in the Pentagon in the early 60s, and somebody praised McNaughton's fairness and sense of decency, and he came back and he said, "John, I want you to know I defended your honor. I swore that you were the most devious, manipulative official I'd ever worked for." And that's the kind of, that's what pays, you know, that's the morality I guess you have to have. It's too bad.
Julian, do you share this sympathy for the press as going up against government and being unable to find these things out?
Well, I'm, you know, like everyone else, I want to know if President Reagan is lying. I want to know if there's something there, I want to know all about it. So sure, I do share that sympathy, but I just wanted to say something about the repetition of mistakes. 2 people at the University of South Carolina wrote a book about Jesse Jackson in which they said that I and other people had given a medal to Muammar Gaddafi. This was repeated in USA Today. It's repeated in the New York Times. It's repeated in Commentary Magazine, repeated in the Palm Beach Daily Record. I've never seen Gaddafi. I've never been to Libya. Except for seeing him on TV, I wouldn't know him if he came in here. And so here's this repetition of lie just again and again and again and again. It's impossible to catch up with, impossible to correct this impression. And, you know, there's a body of people who think I gave this medal to Gaddafi. Well, who's to say I wouldn't have given it to him if I'd seen him? But it's just so irritating, and there's no way to get back. There's no way to correct this. It's just done. It's gone. It's part of the record. And 50 years from now, someone will be writing a history of U.S.-Libyan relations, and this will be a footnote in it, you know.
Your award to Gaddafi.
Yeah, yeah. My giving a Martin Luther King medal to Muammar Gaddafi.
What, can you speculate? You must sometimes speculate on why this happens to you. Why does it specifically happen to you?
I'm just lucky, I guess. I don't think it really happens to me. It has happened to me. It may happen to me again, but I don't think I'm Joe, what's his name, the little Abner character, with a cloud perpetually over my head. As I say, I generally have enjoyed good relationships with journalists. I used to be a publicist for civil rights organizations. My job to get these people, often who weren't interested in what I thought was a big story, and when I was able to, and it worked to our mutual benefit. So I don't think it happens to me as a continuing basis. And I've tried to take steps most recently to make sure it doesn't ever happen to me again. The easiest way to do that is just not to talk to these people. If you know someone has a predisposition, as I think some people do, to get you, then the best thing to do is not to be around them, and when they call, don't answer the phone. When they leave messages, don't call back, because they are wordsmiths. They're geniuses at taking, yes, the sky is blue, and saying Bond seemed to suggest that the sky was blue, but his teeth were clenched, obviously under some strain, you know, and on and on and on. And here you got a psychological portrait of you based on your saying the sky is blue. It's just, you know, something that I just try to avoid as much as I can.
Is that a phenomenon that is widespread? Are there members of the media who are out to get certain public figures? I'm sure Henry Kissinger thinks that about you, Si.
Let's just put it this way.
Are you out to get him? Were you out to get him?
I just think that when the rest of the people can't sleep, my children, your children, anybody, can't sleep, I think in all fairness they're entitled to count little fluffy sheep. I think when Henry Kissinger can't sleep, he probably should count maimed and burned Vietnamese and Cambodian babies. I think it's perfectly appropriate for a journalist to say that this is a man who has the enormous power vested in the U.S. government, the power to come into my house and take my oldest son and daughter and have him, we give this right willingly as citizens, even though we're journalists, to go and fight in the name of, and kill in the name of the American democracy. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to hold him to the highest possible standard. And I see nothing in terms of trying to get him, or there's nothing personal about it. I just simply am holding him to, if he has the power to have my children go kill in the name, and be killed in the name of America, I'm going to hold him to the highest possible standard. And I think the tragedy is, because of the complications of our business and the competition and the concern about rating points, I'm not a Marxist, I don't think it's economic, I think it's simply rating points for ego on the networks. The tragedy is we don't hold people to the highest standards, we fall in bed with them. And it's too bad. I think we have every right to hold somebody with all this power. We're forgetting how much power these guys have. They have 25,000 Americans in the Persian Gulf on an absolute series of madness. And they have that much power. Let's hold them to the highest standards and not worry about whether we're getting them or not. I think that's fair.
Well, it's one thing, you know, when I was in the legislature, if I passed a law or voted on a bill or wasn't there to vote on a bill, and some journalist wants to come at me for any of these reasons, that's fair game. That goes with the territory. That's part of the business. But if John Smith, who works for the whatever, the Doodletown Daily News, personally dislikes me because he thinks, in fact, he knows I'm smarter than he is, and that irritates him, I resent that. I don't want to be the victim of that kind of behavior.
But I think you'll find, believe it or not, that when you're dealing when you're perfectly prepared to be judged on any public issue you take, on any issue, whether you're right, you know, on any public issue you're willing to be judged. And I know, let's say in my book on Kissinger, there was an incredible story about Richard Nixon I knew and his personal life. And there was no way I was going to write that story because it was going to get in the way of the other important stuff I had. Yeah. And that's not anything special on my part. I know that's true of a lot of my colleagues. I guarantee you Jim Polk and Rich can tell you stories, and probably Helen, of devastating stuff they know that may even be important. But you've got other bigger fish to fry. I absolutely agree with you wholeheartedly. If a newspaper is after you when they set up a 15-man team, you are crazy if you answer the door. Give them nothing.
Well, what you just said, Si, you were talking earlier about the power of the government officials, such as Kissinger, which is, granted, very terrific, but I think that the press has tremendous power today, too, more so than ever. I mean, the combination of the print media, the papers like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal,
We can ruin Julian Bond's weekend in a minute. There's no question about that. We can cause them a lot of agony. But I think when it comes to the really big ones, when it comes to the president and some of the big issues, I don't think we have that power. I think we can, in 700 words, commit calumny against anybody, happily and cheerfully, and go on our way and roll them over, and we do it all the time.
Look at Richard Celeste. Here the plain dealer reports that he's
the governor of Ohio.
The governor of Ohio, that thinking about running for president. The plain dealer reports that he's had, and he's married, and he's had affairs with 3 women. They don't know the women or name the women. They haven't talked to the women, and apparently, although I'm not sure of the details, hadn't talked to anybody who had real first-hand knowledge of this. But they print it. Then the Akron Beacon Journal says, well, we wouldn't have printed it ourselves, but because they printed it, we have to print it. And the story goes on. So now this guy is an adulterer. Well, he may, I don't know if he's an adulterer or not, but I certainly don't know it based on this evidence. What happens to his life and his marriage and his reputation in the community? What recourse has he got? What can he do to regain what's been taken for him in just one morning in the newspaper? It's gone. His life is, I'm sure his life goes on. He's still governor of Ohio. He'll never be president of the United States. May never have been president anyway. But, you know, what's this guy to do? Where's his recourse? What can he do to
That's a different kind of power. You're absolutely right, Helen, Julie. The press has enormous power in that case. The power I'm talking about here is in Washington is the institutional power. We have an enormous power to destroy personally people. But the institutions, the very big institutions that we're up against, when it comes to war and death that the president can control, the only point I'm making is that we really can't, you know, believe me, Henry Kissinger may not want to go to dinner with me, but I haven't hurt him one bit in a lot of important ways. He's still, you know, he's still a big man in town. You know, it's really hard to the big guys.
Maybe it's because this press coverage tends to focus on personality, whether or not they're dealing with character or not, but tends to focus on personality. The personality named Ronald Reagan did something, rather than the president did something, and therefore the institution remains unchanged. You may report that he lied, and he may be caught out saying something that's not true, but the basic institution and the props that support it remain the same, remain unchanged.
I want to go to questions from the audience in just a moment, but before we do, raise one other question that goes directly to the theme for tonight. Why doesn't the Washington Press Corps report what it really knows? Issue of current controversy is Bob Woodward's book about William Casey and the CIA. And there are many issues of controversy swirling around it, but one that goes to the subject is that it has been reported, acknowledged, that Bob Woodward had a good deal of information about the Iran-Contra affair, which was withheld. The Washington Post did not report what it really knew or what Bob Woodward really knew about the Iran-Contra affair because he saved the material for his book. Now, I wonder what all of your thoughts are on that subject. Is that proper? Flora Lewis in today's New York Times, writing from Paris, in her column, is outraged. She says this is an abuse of First Amendment rights in some respects. What are your thoughts about that? Is there an obligation to reveal, for the press to reveal what it knows? Rich, you're an editor now. What would you do if he were your reporter on this story?
As a reporter, if I was still a reporter and I had that stuff, I'd be squirreling it away probably and saying, boy, save it for the book, this will sell 100,000 copies. As an editor now, the view changes a little bit. I would have real problems with that arrangement. I have real problems because I think that it perhaps affected the course of the whole Iran-Contra affair, that we, the American people, did not know this 4 or 5 months ago. I think, yes, there was an obligation for this to appear in print in a timely fashion. And if I were an editor, I would have real problems with an arrangement that keeps such a vital piece of information out of the public discourse.
Cy Hersh left the New York Times as a reporter to be an author. I do not believe in reporters simultaneously being authors. As far as Woodward's reported conversation with Casey, let's assume that Woodward believes that to be true. That should have been reported immediately in the Washington Post. It was pertinent to the investigation of the Iran-Contra affair. A reporter has an obligation to inform the public, not to use the information later for his personal profit. I would have fired him.
I concur with Jim on that. I think that that was public information, and it should have been in the Post right away.
Cy?
I think, first of all, you're, as a friend of Bob Woodward's...
As I am too, but I still would have fired him.
I think it's a very safe assumption, and I actually do know it's true, that the story was presented to his editors and discussed. So you're talking about not a Woodward decision. It was a decision, obviously he wanted to hold it back. I don't know what the story is, but I do know it was made at the highest levels. I'm sure the publisher, Don Graham, and the editor, Ben Bradley, knew.
Then I consider them accessories to the sin.
All right, but it's harder to fire yourself. But I would also say that I'm less interested in that story about what Casey did or didn't say, and I can see some of the problems in publishing it in daily journalism because, you know, it's got a lot of tubes running in them. I'm more interested in, I think, the other story when he suggested that Casey had told the president, and there was a finding on the plan to send an assassination team, sort of an advanced anti-terrorism team, the team that ended up going into Beirut and with the aid of Saudi money, triggering a bomb that killed 80 people, many of them children, and wounded 220 others. An atrocity that puts the United States just about a B- to the A you have to give the people that took our Marines out in the barracks, the bombing of the Marine barracks. That's a real crime. And that story interests me very much. That's the one I see.
Well,
I frankly have a lot of problems. I'll be honest, I do have a lot of problems. That story should have been, they should have been beating the President of the United States with that story every day from the moment they got it. And maybe they thought putting it in the book and making it the most important thing in the book would be effective enough.
So maybe then it's a question of packaging. How is it going to be most effective to get the information out? But don't we
forget Bob Woodward had given that paper 100 stories in the last year. And if he wants to hold back some stories, I think their position is going to be that, you know, well, he's entitled to it. I mean,
but how do we weigh this from the public's point of view? Whether the public wasn't entitled to know more of this information at an earlier stage. I think that's the question, and I think that's part of what Jim is expressing.
There's no question that that the public has a real, genuine grievance about that process. I'm just saying, in my defense of Woodward, is that it wasn't just his call. It was made by everybody, and I think they all should be perhaps taken to task. It was too good of a story to sit on. If that's what you're asking. No question. If you have a chance to say that the President of the United States may have known in advance and authorized in writing an operation that led to the murder of 80 people, 80 people in the name of America, I mean, my God, I can't understand. I don't understand why everybody isn't focusing on that instead of that dopey thing about, my line about the Reagan, about Casey saying, I believe, is, you know, somebody said to me, called me the other day, and he could have said, please leave, you know, I mean, who knows? You know.
We will continue this American University Forum after a quick look at our program schedule.
Come to the microphone in the middle aisle, if you will, so that you can be heard throughout the room. I think the best thing is to line up at this microphone. Yes, sir.
Yes. Concern about international impressions on the American press, not only on the news that's going on in general in Washington, in the legislature and the White House, but how does, let's say, the British press or the Russian, or, you know, the Soviet press looks at us, and how do they bring that across to their constituencies through the television and the print? And second of all, what can the American press do to improve its image to the outside world? Since if we're going to continue bearing the standard that we are the leader of the free world. That's for anyone and everyone on the panel.
We're the only nation with the freedom of the press, really, with the First Amendment. Britain has a controlled press on certain issues, so does Canada. I think it benefits our democracy enormously. Watergate was a remarkable period for me because of the upheaval in the most powerful office in the land without either mobs or militia in the streets. I'm not too worried about our image abroad. Democracy and the freedom of the press is one of the things you live with, warts and all. And we're showing you the warts and some other less savory physical features tonight. I think candor and honesty is the way we have to approach our profession. And we're not in the business of imagery. We're in the business of trying to tell the truth here and in the paper.
I'm not sure it holds that the press is not in the business of worrying about imagery these days, but we can get back to that later.
I wanted to address the question about Bob Woodward, or the issue of that. As a student, I had thought that journalists eventually built up a sense of trust among public figures, and for Mr. Woodward to have concealed that information would have been a step in that direction to build trust. And I don't know if he was actually holding it more for the money aspect, more for the trust that eventually does get the information to the people. Is that a valid?
So as Bob's spokesman on this panel, maybe you want to...
Actually, I have a hard time understanding your question.
I'm wondering if
You're suggesting that it may have been withheld in order to build up the trust of his sources rather than in order for financial gain.
This information, if you hold it, I mean, generally.
One of the stories I heard early on when he was talking, there was sort of no secret that he had a lot of access to Casey. That was pretty much known. And one of the stories, I guess, that Casey and his people floated was that there was an understanding that he was to hold it till past 88. But I have my own personal theory for why Casey may have spoken rather frankly to him. I think some of those conversations from the excerpt I read in the Post Sunday began in '65 after he was diagnosed, which Bob may not have known, which none of us knew at the time, as having terminal cancer.
You mean 85?
85, rather. After he was diagnosed as having a terminal cancer, so it could be that he wanted Woodward to tell his story. I mean, that would make some sort of far-fetched psychological sense. Who knows? But, you know, as a spokesman, I'd like a few percentage points on the royalties of that book.
Is it possible that, excuse me, that Woodward could have said to him, when I'm talking to you now, I'm not Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, I'm Bob Woodward, author of a forthcoming book, and made a distinction in that fashion as to what he ought to tell his editors? Or
you know, he would have done a dance on the ceiling to convince him to keep on talking. He would have said anything, I think. So yes, it's possible. It's possible that Casey thought it was going to be a book that was going to be published after the first term, sort of an informal history. The question that lingered, it came up in the review of Woodward's book Sunday, was why would Casey's no dummy, he also can keep secrets, we know that. Why would he talk to a reporter and say as much as he apparently did? And obviously you have to conclude that Casey's view of those conversations, if they were to be made known, would be, you know, diametrically opposed to Woodward's. That's a given, but so what? Woodward survived.
Well, you know, there are a number of people who are old friends of Casey's who really question that he's talked with Woodward.
As much or at all?
At all.
Oh no, he certainly talked to him. And I also believe that Woodward's, you know, look, you know, I also believe that he interpreted his interpretation of that meeting in the hospital room. I'm sure that's what he thought. And I'm sure that he honestly is convinced that's what happened. And you know, he's not very big on shooting himself in the foot. He certainly talked to Casey a lot. How long he talked to him? A lot. That's known. But known inside the agency. I've had people in the government tell me stories. Tony Motley, there's no reason not to say this, told me with great amazement, who's obviously a source, told me that Woodward called him once and wanted to talk about Casey, and he said, I called up Casey, and Casey said, talk to him. He said he just couldn't believe it, so he did. Sort of amazing, sort of, it's one of those wonderful things that makes our business so exciting. If you wonder why people like to be in journalism, that's one. You just never know. It's sort of fun.
The one thing that the family and the CIA are claiming that Woodward did not even get into the room because it would have been impossible. Now, the CIA, if anybody should know that it's always possible to penetrate security, one would hope it would be the CIA that would know that. That I think is a very far-fetched
People
claim.
go to the bathroom, you know, I mean, stuff like that.
Yeah. Next.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the press and the potential presidential candidates. Recently, the Miami Herald and Gary Hart, CBS News and New York Times after Joe Biden, and I'm wondering, I guess my question is, what about George Bush and Felix Rodriguez, the connections with the Contras, or Pat Robertson and private aid to the Contras, where it seems to be a real partisan issue. Is the press, I'm just wondering, is the cult of Reagan still there, that the Republicans are still a little unapproachable? It's still, even after the wake of Iran-Contra, it's still not kosher to attack Republicans, and is it much easier to kick the Democrats?
I, as a Republican, will say to you that the Republicans have been kicked very hard, and I think they have gone very strong after George Bush, trying to find something there. And there has certainly been no let-up because of Republicans. No way. In fact, Republicans feel that they have been kicked much harder over the years than Democrats ever have been.
That's a fair summary from a reporter's perspective, too. But one reason the Republicans have been kicked so hard is they've been in power in the White House 13 of the last 17 years.
Not in power on Capitol Hill, my friend.
Yeah, we kick a lot of Democrats.
You know, look at what the story is on Capitol Hill right now, and that hasn't been printed.
What's the story in Capitol Hill?
I'm not going to talk about it.
We know what you But we know, and we're not going to tell you either. We know.
Anyone want to tell us?
Come on, you know too, don't you, Rich?
Not I.
Uh-huh.
Jim?
Well, I'm waiting to hear Helen tell me. I hope she'll. Can we talk privately with this?
I'll talk to you privately afterward.
Now that is really unfair to the audience. I mean, you're all holding back.
It's about a candidate, a Republican candidate, and his alleged sexual proclivities.
Oh, no.
Different one?
I was talking
But
about the
that
Democrats.
one's 20 years old.
Oh.
I was talking about the Democrats.
Oh, I thought you were talking about another story.
No, I'm talking about the Democrats. That's been held back on the Democrats.
For the questioner, it wasn't George Bush Cy was talking about.
Well, you know that
Hey, by the way, Jim, don't you think, I've come to the conclusion about Bush. My thought about Bush is, guys have been looking at Bush, just to show you, guys have really been looking at Bush, not only because of Rodriguez and all, you know, this is a guy that seems, you just can't put him anywhere. Oil interests, he's always sort of around the pharmaceuticals and the oil companies, and he goes, I think Bush just may be smart. I've always just thought of him as a real dummy. I'm beginning to think, I'm upgrading my opinion of him. I'm beginning to think he is a lot brighter than we think he is. He has been so close to trouble and always gets away from it.
You know, the guy made a few million before he was 30 years old on his own, so.
He just might be.
He started out with daddy's money, too.
Next question.
Mine is a little bit like the previous one, but I'm wondering how editors decide how to make assignments to go after who, and I'll tell you why. I'm from Atlanta. And I remember the week after the 15 reporters signed that article on Julian, there was also an article in a Democratic Socialist paper called In These Times, which was about the fact that some of the testimony or investigation various bodies had done about the Iran-Contra scandal revealed apparently that certain Republican businessmen in Atlanta had set up a dummy corporation for the purpose of channeling arms to the Contras through the Southeast, from sources in the Southeast, I guess. And so I thought that was pretty interesting, and I kept reading the paper, you know, and I sort of wondered what they'd come up with, and they didn't come up with anything. So the next week, I ran into a guy named Tom Baxter, who's the national editor for the monopoly newspaper in Atlanta, the Journal-Constitution. He's a nice guy. I happen to know him slightly. And I said, Tom, what about this story, you know, that was in These Times? And he said, yeah, I know about that. In fact, I've never read it, but I've got this reporter on it. I think his name is David Montgomery, one reporter. And I said, well, great, I'll send you a copy of the article. I did, and there was never anything in the paper. Now, maybe they didn't find anything substantial. I like to think that's the reason. But why was one reporter on that local angle for the Iran-Contra story and 15, you know?
I think I can answer that for you. First of all, newspapers cover news in their own backyards. People read news in their own backyards, and the situation in Atlanta was not confined to State Senator Julian Bond. There was an allegation that the mayor of Atlanta had made a phone call to the accusing witness suggesting that one ought to reconsider one's accusations, and then the U.S. attorney began an obstruction of justice investigation. It may have led nowhere, but questions of conduct on the local governing authorities are always looked at by newspapers, and what happens closest to home is looked at most intensely by the local newspaper.
Moreover, you also have to bear in mind that newspapers and broadcast outlets as well are finite organizations. You have so many people, you have so many things that you want to look into, you have so much money and so much time that you can devote to looking into things, and people make judgments. The judgments are frequently fallible. Nonetheless, it's a fact of life that people have to make judgments, and sometimes you have stories that look interesting, but you look at the whole story and you decide this is a low percentage story.
But Rich, there's another question that actually lurks inside that question, which is whether things that are reported in the alternative or not mainstream press, whether those things don't tend to get ignored almost as a matter of policy by the mainstream media. That if it was first published in These Times, then it has to be a sort of radical fringe sort of point of view, and therefore does not deserve the same amount of attention. Isn't that the way editors often respond in the mainstream media?
There is a plausibility factor that editors apply, and I would be lying if I said that sometimes that is not a factor. By the same token, stories that get started sometimes in publications like Mother Jones do have a tendency to snowball. I mean, the publication that broke the Iran-Contra story, while not exactly in these times, was certainly did not have a high track record for reliability, but if the story is big enough, it gets out.
How many editors in the Wall Street Journal do you think read in these times?
Not enough, probably.
I mean, one?
I don't, I've got to admit.
I can't think of anybody I ever saw reading in the New York Times.
Well, I mean, even having worked at National Public Radio, I can tell you that there were times when we broke stories that simply were not picked up because radio didn't break stories. I mean,
NPR in particular. Don't forget, you guys are distinctly liberal.
NBC breaks stories that nobody else notices.
Well, that's true, too.
The Wall Street Journal does, believe it.
Yes, quite a bit.
Yeah.
Everybody's been equally persecuted. Yes?
Well, I think it's kind of amusing. My question leads into, along the line of what the Wall Street Journal reporter was saying there, that people don't, saying that people do not read in these times. I happen to read in these times also. I mean, it's just a coincidence. But it leads to the point of the arrogance of the larger press people that are out there. And that's what my question deals with. Mr. Hersh, you're making the statement that, well, we have to hold these public people up to higher standards. You know, it's, to me, it's kind of funny. You know, you've got some guy that's digging around in the trash can in the White House, you know, or scouring along 14th Street trying to find some congressperson or something, you know, and he comes out the next...
That's not really how we do it.
Well, however it gets done.
A lot of it's just going through dry financial records. There's nothing glamorous about it.
Well, however it gets done. You know, it's like somebody coming up from the bilges of the bottom of the ship and saying to the captain, I want to hold you to high standards.
I love your rhetoric, but not your reasoning.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, at any rate, the question that I really want to ask is, when are you going to start holding yourselves to the same standards? And the reason I ask that, because it seems to me if it's credible to say that someone like Joe Biden, who was only a candidate, or someone like Gary Hart, who was only a candidate, and I blame Gary Hart for his own misfortune. You know, he should have just said it's none of your damn business. But people like this, if we say that they somehow have to be held to a high standard, why can't we hold the Ted Koppels and the Rathers, and not to leave out anybody, the Polks and the Hershes to these same standards? Why don't you go out? You have the same influence to make or break an individual as any of these Congress people have. Why don't you hold yourself to those standards and start reporting on yourselves?
I'll give you a good answer.
Then you'll see the need for integrity.
I'll give you a good answer.
You're going to get a bunch of answers.
Well, let me give a good answer. One good answer off the top. One good answer off the top is simply, I'm not telling anybody to go die or be killed. Okay? And I think there's a differentiation. I'm not telling anybody to go out and kill for America. And there's a big difference between me, if you want to say the bilge carrier, but we're not big players in this. I disagree with Helen about it. I don't think we're big players on this.
You don't think Dan Rather's a big player?
Dan Rather isn't telling anybody to go kill anybody. He doesn't have any power to tell anybody to do that. He's not.
I'm going to give you two answers. First,
so I think there's a perfectly valid reason you don't want to hold us to that. First of all, well, why are you troubled by that?
Because I know for a fact that it wasn't until Mike Wallace, for instance, came out against the Vietnam War that the big shift occurred in public opinion. You do have that power.
Cronkite, but that's okay.
Or against the
No, it was Cronkite. Cronkite came out against.
Your observations are fair.
So you do have that power.
Oh, well, no, we don't have the power, but we do have an effect.
Well, you don't want the
times.
responsibility.
Can we answer you now?
Be fair and let Jim Polk answer.
Philosophically, I believe that public service is the noblest of all professions. To be delegated the authority by mankind and womankind to make decisions, critical decisions on their behalf. It is an honorable profession, and most of the people who occupy those delegated positions of authority are honorable men and women regardless of political stripe. I think if the public accords them the trust, the public can expect to hold them to a higher standard. It's a trade to hold the public service to a higher standard. It's a trade-off with the privilege of being allowed to make decisions on behalf of one's fellow person. Now, that's what I believe. Now, as far as the press is concerned, I think
the press employers have been a little slow. I happen to think that financial disclosure for the press wouldn't be a bad idea at all. I'm a stickler for putting in, I even put down the baby gifts I got from public officials who were friends on the financial disclosure that's filed with NBC. I wouldn't mind seeing drug testing for the media. I think maybe the media... No, it affects the performance. And frankly, we've had a couple problems with it.
Next you'll be in the liquor.
Yeah.
Ask yourself this question also. If somebody had become president of the United States and some glaring character flaw that this person had gone unreported until that person became president of the United States with their finger on the button that could trigger a nuclear war, I dare say that a lot of people would be very, very upset and say, why didn't we know this sooner? It's our job to tell you things. Sometimes we tell you things that you think you don't want to hear, but the absence of the reverse is rather unthinkable.
And there's one, let me jump in. There's one other factor in here. When we do take disciplinary steps, and we do, against reporters for crossing personal as well as professional standards, or just simply bad judgment, it's done very privately and you never hear about it. They simply disappear.
But I wonder, do you really, do you think, is your attitude shared? I mean, I just wonder, just sort of, do you think that many people, do you represent more than yourself, do you think? Do you think that people share your views? That we in the press are such that we really,
Go to the microphone so that...
Well, let's just
wonder.
Let's I pose the question, take a hand poll.
I just wonder, some of you think that we really should be held to a high moral standard as equally as high as the public officials we write about?
I think the gentleman may believe that there's a hypocrisy. Are you saying that it's hypocritical on the part of the media?
And with response to your question, I know for a fact. I was just in a taxi cab this morning, and I had a taxi cab driver bring the point up out of nowhere. You know, you get on television and you say that we have to hold these public servants to some high standard of integrity, some standard that you've set arbitrarily, and it's different at each network, in each media center. But we don't know anything about the people who are doing the reporting. And just let me just say this.
I'm just pointing.
You know, we don't know anything about the people who are doing the reporting. And it isn't until after we find out the stories that, well, my God, you know, they had a camera in Gary Hart's bedroom, or they chased Joe Biden down the airport stand and tried to trip him or something, or some ridiculous, Julian Bond, you know better than anybody up there, you know, what the press does in terms of its own integrity. But I'll finish with this. It seems to me like the height of hypocrisy.
I'll tell you what your problem
constantly
is.
saying have integrity and then you don't have it.
You have a point. I think it's your examples that are so offensive to me anyway. You know, the notion of digging through garbage. I think if you'd come on and you said, what about a Gary Wills that was best man or usher at Bork's wedding, writing columns about Bork in defense of him without explaining that sort of contact? Or what about people who sup at the, sit at the table of the president, have dinner, some of the reporters, Evans, or whatever the rumors are, whatever this. I think if you talk about that, reporters or columnists who don't disclose personal relationships and then write about it, or who have vendettas, I think then you've got a question, a really serious question. But I think the way you posed it really troubles me, because that isn't...
So that from a reporter who went through the trash at the White House.
Come on, I mean, but that's not where it's at. None of us would...
White House
You can't get to the trash.
None of us...
When you say, I know for a fact, that you got a name wrong already on Cronkite, you're reporting, what you're doing is reporting things you think, not things you know.
So I wanted to ask the question that was on my mind.
Jim,
if I were you, I take a cab out of here quick, fella. There's 5 of us.
Jim, you had suggested asking whether the audience agrees that the press ought to be held the same standard.
I think the site asked how many people agreed to the gentleman who was questioning. I'm just curious, how many of you think reporters ought to be held to a higher standards openly of integrity in their personal and financial lives than they are now? And how many disagree? How many let us get away with what we continue to do?
Wow, there's a lot.
Drinking too much. Thank you for letting me have that extra scotch at night.
You know, I've been on a lot of panels, for the last few months. It's been real great. Tom Fielder and Kevin Sweeney and I have made a lot of joint appearances. And we're up in Boston on a panel with some other Boston journalists, and one of them is Bob Healy of the Boston Globe, and he said just what you said, that there ought to be some kind of disclosure. What stocks does Katharine Graham own? Where is her money invested? What boards of directors does she sit upon?
That's easy to find out.
Well,
Not what stock she owns.
No, the
it's not that
second
easy.
one is. The second one is easy to find out. Boards of directors.
And if reporter Smith writes a story about General Motors, does reporter Smith own General Motors stock? Or perhaps he owns stock in another automobile company. I want to know these things because you can't tell me that it doesn't affect that person's judgment. You can't tell me that this objectivity is not swayed in some form or fashion.
But that's a better
I want
example.
to know.
You're right.
I want to know.
On with that. But
when Healy suggested this, every single one of the journalists, hey, no, not me. We're not sending people off to war. We're not giving people orders to be killed. But I want to know.
Painless process for most of us.
See, yours is on file at NBC. Can I go look at it?
No, but my conflict of interest form has to be filed with the FCC, and you can look at it, yeah. But most reporters it's a painless process because there's a doggone poor anyway.
We had a case which has gotten an awful lot of publicity a few years ago where one of our employees who wrote a rather widely watched stock market column was tipping off people who were making trades for him in the stocks that he was writing about. The law came down pretty hard on him. Whether the law should have or shouldn't have is a somewhat messy legal issue. But I can tell you the next morning that there were an awful lot of very sad people at the Wall Street Journal because that person betrayed the trust that we have really worked quite hard to try and build up among our readers. I don't think you have a right to know what stocks I own. I don't think that's relevant to anything. I think you do have a right to know that I'm not writing about stocks or trying to influence stocks that I have a position in. And I think any news organization worth its salt has a code of ethics. You can't keep people from breaking the code of ethics. Someone is going to do it, and unfortunately it happened to us. But you do have a right and a responsibility to ask the news organization, what is your code of ethics?
You know, I'm talking to a woman friend of mine, a Jewish woman friend of mine about what's happened to me, and of course I want to complain as much as I can. And she tells me one of the editors involved in it, she says, of course he's a racist, but that doesn't affect his journalistic ethics. So I said to her, of course Hitler was an anti-Semite, but that didn't affect his running the German government. She said, oh, I see what you mean. Well, what the hell? I mean, this guy's a racist, and he's writing about me. I want to know. If he's got one of the elements in this story was a Hispanic woman. This guy's file on this case was called The Mulatto and the Aztec Princess. I want to know. I want to know.
Sorry.
The one comment that I have to make on this discussion is that we need high standards on both sides. We need high standards from the public officials, and we need high standards from the journalists. There is one thing that has been bothering me in recent years, and that is, are we, with all of the disclosures and all of the public pressures, turning away a number of good people from entering public life? And that does bother me, and I know that there are a number of people who say, you know, I'm not going to go through that nonsense. I'm not going to be up there and be ripped apart constantly by the press. You know, because there seems to be an attitude that some of the press will go after people and will rip them apart regardless. And that has a lot of people turned off.
I don't think it's keeping anybody from running. You know, I had to file disclosure statements and had to list my campaign finances in a fairly exacting fashion. It's irritating to do because it's fairly time-consuming. You have to keep pretty detailed records, but you know, if you want to be in office, you have to do those kinds of things. I'd just like to see some of the burden put on the people who are talking about me. I want to know who they are. I want to know what shapes them, what makes them.
I want to respond to the Congresswoman. I think the scrutiny comes with the turf, and Raymond Donovan's had the same complaints you have, and I've said to him, I think it's, I'm sorry, it's a given. The scrutiny, fair or otherwise, comes with the turf. I do not see it discouraging good people in either party. I think what keeps good people out of government service is the ridiculously low pay, and that's up to you, Congresswoman.
I think we're going to take just one more question.
Well, let's take everybody in line. They've been patient with us.
All right, if we can move along quickly, we'll take everybody in line. That's true, but we're running over. You were the one who wanted to be out of here at 9 sharp.
I know, but so what if television runs over?
My question has two parts. The first part is that there seems to be a dichotomy when reporting issues affecting the black community in terms of elected officials. When activities that are leveled against the black, for example, the issue with Mayor Berry, issues that are leveled against black officials across the country are put side by side with issues from the White House or from Capitol Hill, for example. The issues are not in any way comparable, but at the same time, the degree of character assassination, the degree of polarization that is created by the media when reporting on black elected officials, I think is offensive at most times, and at other times, it tends to create a dichotomy in the society. That's one. The second question is, why is it that this Washington media shuts its mouth so much when President Reagan on activities that arises from the White House, especially policy issue affecting minorities? The media now is silent on it, and it must not be the in thing. And I wonder why those issues are never brought up.
I'm going to take the first half of your question. I know Cy is prepared to answer the second half of the question. The first, no, because I've heard you answer it. On the Mayor Berry and the positioning of the coverage, you're only reading the Washington papers. Marion Berry is getting very little coverage in Memphis or Dallas or St. Louis. It's not on the front page there because he's our mayor, not their mayor. The local stories are always make the front page. Now, you can call it character assassination, but there is a federal investigation. I don't know which way it'll lead. There have been some guilty pleas and convictions, and I'm sorry to say corruption is an equal opportunity employer. There are going to be both blacks, whites, greens, and purples stray from the rules at times, and I know there's a lot of racial polarization in this town. Is ridiculous.
As an example, the problem is across the board. It is national. It is not a localized problem. And the degree to which
I've seen stories about black mayors under investigation in Detroit. I've seen stories about white mayors under investigation in Boston. I don't think it's imbalanced on coverage. Most of the crooks are white because most of the power is still in white hands. And most of the stories I've done have been about whites for that reason.
You know, there's a report issued last weekend at the Congressional Black Caucus which listed some of these things. An old report, and it was updated, not updated very well. But if you read it, you cannot help but be seized with the long, long list of investigations of black state legislators, black mayors, black city councilmen, black city council members, black county commissioners, and follow the investigation or charge, and then trial, and then acquittal, or charge dropped. I mean, just over and over and over. Now, you know, as you said, black politicians can steal just as well as the next person, can take bribes, can do all of the things that public officials do at their worst. But it just staggers the imagination not to believe that in editorial offices around the country and prosecutors' offices around the country, there is at least an unconscious conspiracy when old power arrangements are upset and a black person, or Hispanic person I'd imagine, or in some cases a female person, upsets the old arrangements of power, a shockwave goes through certain communities and they react with the tools at their disposal. And the tools at their disposal are character assassination, they are investigation without cause, and, you know, sometimes convictions result and people go to jail, and as they should if they've done something wrong. But you read this report, it's frightening to see. These people report an interview with William Webster as head of the FBI, and he said 40% of black elected officials were under investigation by the FBI. There was a period of time about 10 or 15 years ago when the Internal Revenue Service just, people I know, friends of mine, just bam, 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 bam. The only thing these people had in common is they're black and they held public office. And I don't believe one of them went to jail, but just leak and innuendo and so on, just an attempt to side. And this is just not the press. But let me tell you another example. Yesterday in the Washington Post there's a story about the presidential campaign, and it says the two leading candidates, Dukakis and Gephardt. Dukakis and Gephardt are not the leading candidate by the standard used until he reached it is Jesse Jackson. Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? They've dismissed, this man is gone. He's out of the race. He's finished, kaput, done. The two leading candidates, Dukakis and Gephardt. Jackson is the leading candidate in the race right now. I'm sure he won't be November of next year, but he's the leading candidate in the race right now, and he ought to be called the leading candidate. And it's not necessary for them to, you know, in this small, petty way to dismiss him in this fashion, and to dismiss the hopes of the people who support him.
Rich, I'd like to say something here. You think that only the blacks elected officials have been attacked by the media and have been indicted, etc. Let's just take the case of Raymond Donovan, who was the Secretary of Labor, and who they went after and after and after, and they finally had trials of lengthy trial. He was acquitted. But meanwhile, that man was destroyed. Jim Biggs, who was head of NASA, he was destroyed. And he was, and the Justice Department admitted that they should never have gone after him.
But that was not a media investigation.
No, that was not, but it was, he was in the paper. Well, I mean, you had all of the press stuff.
Well, one of your problems, the Donovan case was a local prosecutor in the Bronx who brought the charges just for the election. I'm convinced it was simply dirty politics, but the press cannot argue the innocence of a man. Innocence exists in a vacuum. It has nothing you can grab onto to debate it point by point, and worst of all, like a vacuum, it can be punctured at any time.
Listen, we're going to have to move on, or there'll be no one left in the room to listen to us. I did want to just ask Rich Yaroslavsky to respond on to the general point about the tendency to investigate minorities or people who have shaken up the traditional power arrangements. Is that true in the media? Do you think that the media are still sufficiently white-dominated, male-dominated, establishment-dominated, that this is the case?
There's no question that the media are white, male, establishment dominated. I suspect that kind of thing probably is more of a problem on a local level and on a fairly isolated level. I may be doing a grave injustice to small-town newspapers, but I think the bigger you get, the more sophisticated you get, the less likely that's going to be to happen.
Wait a second. The guy's point is that what Ronald Reagan does on black policies is simply ignored by most of the press. And I would give you a very good, simple, one-word answer for why he's right. And that's called racism. It exists. It's here. It's a factor. There's no sense in pretending it doesn't.
Most of the press is white.
That's all. Just racism. Good old-fashioned, where is he? It's just good old-fashioned racism. I know you're shocked to find out it exists in America today as a black man, but you heard it here first.
The modern-day press, it seems to me, has responsibility of projecting images of candidates. And what I would like to know is personal feelings, your personal feelings, or the personal goals of organizations must play a certain part in what you feel about a candidate. And what you feel, you project to the people. These images are very powerful. How can we keep the American people safe from falling victim to maybe your biases, your feelings? How can the press be less biased? And I don't say that there's a bias that leans to the right or to the left. It seems it's non-denominational. It goes for everybody. Is there any way that we can get rid of that as long as there's human nature involved with the reporters?
I don't think it was bias that got Donna Rice in that bedroom. Come on. I think you're overdoing it. All of the candidates appear on television more than enough by the time the election rolls around, and every one of you gets a good taste of them. You really do. And it's an unfiltered taste. You get to see them and hear them at panels and all those meetings, and I think that more than anything else really projects, is the way that people make determinations these days.
Moreover, the press is not a monolith. You'll be bombarded by information, much of it contradictory, and I do have a lot of sympathy for the voter who's got to make up his mind, but there's a certain obligation you have, too, to listen to all this and make up your own mind.
But it also becomes difficult when the headlines lead you to believe certain things. And when on the nightly news...
How would you deal with that, though? How would you deal with that problem?
Well, I think for the questioners such as Sam Donaldson, who go to White House news conferences and instead of asking questions, throw accusations at the president, that has a certain effect on the American people. The respect for the president, it seems, has been decreased, whether or not...
The respect for Sam Donaldson was decreased. You judge him at the same time.
Well, it was just recently with his little incident at the podium. And I'm not attacking any individuals because everyone has emotions, and these can be colored. As Mr. Bond knows, and as he has said, that anyone, when you write an article, you color it the way you want to color it. And these things are very powerful. And Mr. Bond has testified to this, and he knows.
But of course, everyone makes subjective judgments, but what I'm asking you is what would you do about it? What are you suggesting ought to be done?
Well, there are certain things Mr. Kennedy, President Kennedy, would not invite certain people in to his office. He wouldn't give them the stories. There are certain punishments that can be inflicted on the press. Now, there are some people who are tenacious enough to go out and get the story. I don't fault anyone for that. That's your job. But there are certain responsibilities with the press to decide whether or not Gary Hart's infidelities have anything to do with the issues. The morality of a candidate is decided on where he stands on the issues, not whether or not he sleeps with Donna Rice. And is it the person's responsibility to show many pictures of Donna Rice for a week straight, sitting on Gary Hart's lap? That produces a very strong mental image that's hard to get out of the heads and minds of the voters, and this transcends.
The reason that had so much effect is everybody read it and looked at it. You pick up the Washington Post in the morning, and you don't read most of the articles. You don't look at most of the pictures. The reason Hart had a problem is these are pictures and articles the public read. The public was interested in. The public did judge him on that standard. I write a lot of stories that people pay no attention to. And the public still makes... No, I can tell you about a former assistant attorney general who violated the arms embargo to Iran in 79 and 80. The story had to break on Memorial Day weekend and just went away.
Who was that?
Stanley Pottinger. Even then, we did another story when his name was in the list of the overt acts on the time. It's the public makes the final judgment whether they're going to use this standard or not. Now, you've got a problem on bias. I want to answer that one for you. It is not a bias by party lines. The real problem is reporters see there is pandering in politics for the vote. And if there is a bias problem among the press, is unfortunately too many reporters form a contempt for the politicians they cover. That's the bias that hurts.
And if there is a bias in all of you, what responsibility do you have to project that I may be a reporter who stands a little bit left or right of center? Could you have to project that? Because your point of view is very important to how you write your stories and how you project your stories.
And you've got First Amendment rights too, but we're 15 minutes over and we've got two people behind you, and I want to end this forum somewhere on the same evening that we promised to do it.
Thank you much for your time.
Okay. Just for the record, though, I think the problem that you're confusing is most reporters, believe it or not, this is no great art form, it's a trade, but most of us understand something, which is this. We understand what we see and what our job is, to report what we can verify. And often we are in a position of reporting what we personally find repugnant. And often we're in a position of reporting something that as a good Democrat we might know hurts the Democrats. I don't understand why you would think that all reporters, because they have personal views which we're entitled to have, wouldn't do our job as well as we could. I think that's really demeaning to all of us. Some certainly are idiots and fools and corrupt.
And I'm
but the overwhelming percentage of the people here, we could disagree on a million different social issues and we would all see a story the same way and report it the same way.
Well,
and that's our business, that's our profession, and it is a profession.
The other problem I have, Si, is that the cure, I'm afraid, would be to render everything so bland and lacking in subjectivity and feeling that no one would pay any attention to public affairs at all.
What happened to Julian, as he tells us, the more facts I hear about it, if there was a journalism profession, what these people did to you, if you're right, and I presume you are, for the sake of this panel anyway, they should be run out of business. They should be shut down tomorrow. Some very serious stricture, and you should really make it a point. That story you told about the editor and what he said, I think that should be a well-known story all over the world. It really should, about him.
But my local paper will not print that story. The U.S. attorney said, we have no evidence that Julian Bond is guilty of any crime. This is in Time magazine. I'm waiting to see it in the Atlanta Journal, the Atlanta Constitution, the paper my mother reads and my children read. I'm waiting to see this in this paper. But I had to read it in Time magazine. I got some more stories.
But you understand... But Julian, you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know that's very, very bad.
Yeah.
And your point is it's well below the standards that you're used to. In all those years you were in business, you know there are standards, and some of us have standards. A lot of us have standards. The overwhelming percentage of us have standards.
Sure, when I complain, it's just, you just didn't like what you read about yourself. That's all. You just are complaining because your private life was made public. That's all. This is media bashing that you're doing. You're just trying to escape from the embarrassment of having your private life tried it out in public. Well, sure, it's embarrassing, but these people treated me in a disgraceful way. And if there was justice in this world, You're right, they would be closed down, but they won't. They'll publish tomorrow morning.
This question is for the three reporters. Let's say you come across a story that, if it was printed, would endanger national security. Would you go on and report the story, or would you just sit on it, in the name of national security?
May I ask you to amend that question? In whose judgment would the story endanger national security?
Let's say United States is going to invade a country.
Now, his question was the reporter's definition. Well, let's go ahead and answer the question. I have sat on them on my own judgment without being asked by anybody. Generally, I've sat on them until the problem would pass and I could still be the first to go with the story. How about you, Si?
Well, I have a big problem. I've come to redefine national security basically in this day is to be, getting better air and water for all of us. So I'm in a minority on national security issues these days. I don't know what national security is anymore, but the basic question is the hardest question you can ask, and the one that came up in the 1971 Pentagon Papers case, when it was argued, was, I think it was Berger, asked,
Stewart.
Was it Justice Stewart asked Alexander Begel, the Times attorney, whether or not the Times would publish if let's say it was 1916 and we had a U-boat, we had the Americans were shipping doughboys to Germany, to Western Europe rather, somewhere, France, for the trench warfare, and we know that the Nazis had U-boats outside the New York harbor in international water. Would we publish the date of that ship, knowing that the U-boats were there? And Beckel said no, that would be an appropriate time for the papers to exceed the national security. And I scream and rant on that particular, I find that offensive. I think the answer then would be that yes, you publish it, because presumably you make the assumption that if you know something, other people may, and you make them change the date of the ship sailing, and keep the secret this time. So you publish it, and you force them to change. It's just as arguable. So national security, I don't think there's ever a question.
Most national security questions are decided, much like the example Si gave, on whether somebody's life is going to be endangered, which was the proposition there. Unfortunately, it's always defined as American lives. We'll protect the American lives and not tell Tripoli the bombing raid is coming, or Grenada the invasion is coming.
That's right.
The better answer in that case, though, was that it is difficult, if not impossible, ever to draw a direct link between some report in the media and the loss of life, American or other lives. That the case is so rare, as the hypothetical, and the several hypotheticals in that argument were so difficult to bring to reality that it becomes very difficult to make that judgment when things should be withheld. The question I would ask you is, would you take the government's word, any government's word, because the government's definition of national security is almost invariably really embarrassment to that administration and not an objective view of national security?
Right now I'm in the School of Communication and I'm studying to be a journalist. I guess...
it's a noble profession,
I guess I
clearly.
investigate further into it.
He gave the right answer. Okay. Last question.
Earlier this evening you were talking about how the president must be put to the highest standard because he is the one that holds in his hand being able to send your children, my peers, off to war. But oftentimes I think it's forgotten that Congress is the ones that put the stamp on it and confirm that we're all going to war. You were also speaking that presidential candidates are under a lot of scrutiny, more so than anybody else, because they may be a president who will then be under the highest standard. But there's 535 people up on the Hill who are also putting the stamp of approval that it seems are not under this highest standard. Many of them, as you said earlier, with Wilbur Mills. Wilbur Mills, we all knew, had a drinking problem, but it didn't come out till his girlfriend jumped in the tidal basin. There are many, unfortunately, representatives and senators who are like Wilbur Mills, in a powerful position, but have fallen under the addictions of both narcotics and alcohol, which both blur their decision-making. How can we, as journalists, hopefully I will be a journalist if I ever get out of here, how can we decide that the president is under this highest standard, but the Congress is not until Fannie Farmer jumps in the tidal basin. We are taught here that the press is the watchdog of not only the executive, but the legislative and the judicial branches. Yet it seems that they're only really reporting on the executive. What I want to know is why the Washington Press Corps doesn't report what it knows.
Well, if you would read Roll Call each week, Roll Call is the Hill's gossip publication, you will find that nothing is sacred in there. And nothing that any of the members do is kept away from publication in there.
Nothing?
Well, I mean, well,
I know lots.
most things. Many of the things that she's referring to are laid out in there.
But why
some of them are picked up in the daily press, some of them are not. But there have been a number of members of Congress right now who are under scrutiny, who've been indicted or who have been recently before the Ethics Committee. Roll Call is the one who covers that in the most complete fashion. In fact, when I want to know what's going on the Hill, that's what I read.
I think you gave your own answer in the question. There are 535 of them. And for most of us, it's too many to keep track of. It's not quite as powerful as you suggest. The power is so splintered in the House and the Senate because there are so many of them. Unless the hometown paper keeps track of the hometown congressman, my goodness, you have to have a name to even be quoted in the paper. You have to. It's an impossible redundancy. If you're Congressman Schmuck from Montana, and you may have the world's best idea for solving that deficit problem Helen mentioned in the beginning, you won't get a second on NBC News because you're Congressman Schmuck. If you're Senator Dynasty with the same idea, you might get your 15 seconds.
It's all in the name, I think, from your example.
And the same thing, well, that applies to ideas. That's one of the problems with the press, but it also applies to personal behavior.
What you're saying, though, implicitly is that Congress is a failing institution. Is that what you're trying to say?
I'm just trying to figure out, being a journalism student, how we decide when to report on these problems.
We've all given up. I've given up on Congress as a viable tool on foreign policy.
Watchdog of all three branches.
They get a D minus. They get a D minus for foreign policy.
Well, let me say this: journalism gives you one of the best foundations for any future activity you might undertake, whether it's going into business or whether it's going into public life, etc. Journalism is a great foundation for it, and I'm very pleased and proud of my 25 years in it.
You never went through a trash can?
Nope.
Okay.
I said earlier that I think public service is a very honorable profession. I think the Congresswoman said reporting is an honorable profession too, and I thank her for that.
I think we'll end it at that. I want to thank you all for